Hello out there. Let us have our chat show up on the screen and we will see who turns up. Because we are now live. It is officially too hot to wear the brown monk robe kind of thingy today. That's not going to change. That's going to continue to become even more so, I think, as time goes on. That is a winter thing. That is a winter thing because it gets really cold in here in the winter. Now, I've got a whole bunch of stuff set up, and I'm going to spend just a second derping around and finding out. Let's see, okay. Device 16A. This isn't really important, but I want to find out whether I can capture stuff on the audio input. Okay, I think that'll probably work. Assuming that my output is going to the headphones that I'm using. Technically, are there ways that I can find out whether this is working or not? And one of them is as follows. Don't mind me playing with the controls. Let's see here. Now I've got the Rhodes on there, so if I turn audio input capture to advanced and have it set to monitor, it does not give me anything because the output for this is the speakers again. So, yay. Don't mind me, I'm just doing a little work for advanced plans that are coming along. Hey, Patrick. Friend of Whiteseas, perhaps? Because that's who came and visited my stream last time around. And I think Whitesea is based in Holland, and that's why I ask. It's pretty much what I'm going to do is try to work out how to do my record playing and being able to comment on that for the Wednesday streams before I actually have to do them, because that will mean that when I do start doing that, I will have it set up from the word go and won't derp around being confused by my own technology, which is always the way, isn't it? Being confused by one's own technology is a constant challenge, I think. Hey, questions. So I will fire right up, because essentially, although I do have a question that came to me by email, so what I'm going to do is go and grab that so that I can refer to it later. Generally, when I'm mixing the Tuesday live streams, which is kind of interesting because that's kind of like a mixing without a net, because I'm thinking mostly about making notes and running stuff on the synthesizers and stuff. And mixing proves to be a bit of a distraction. But if I don't do it properly, then the live stream sounds terrible. And that's a one-time deal, because that's going through an analog board, and when I finish with it, I shut everything off, and it all goes away again. Hey, Bo. So when I am mixing the Tuesday live streams, as you can probably see if you watch them, it's speakers all the way. And the speakers that I'm using are modified Yamaha NS10s, and there's a subwoofer, and the subwoofer is, I have a video of that too, in which I built it, because the subwoofer is it would cost about $200 or so to make your own, and it is a 4 12-inch woofer, giant monster subwoofer. That's not including the amplifier. So you'd have to have some way of amplifying it. And that's part of the monitoring system always. I don't monitor with just the NS10s. I need to have extremely low frequencies going on because the sort of dub techno-y type stuff that I do demands it. So yeah, I do not mix on headphones, and there's some specific reasons why I don't mix on headphones also. Namely, headphones can be really distracting. I can dive right in. Oh, I could tell or I could show, or both. If we're game with me, not as such, no. I'm not as interested in taming the mid-peak so much as I am heightening the existing capacities of them. Because the thing about NS10s is it's not about them sounding bad. It's about that they're sealed box enclosures that dissipate energy in a particular way. So if you do a waterfall plot, and you might have seen those at some point. And a waterfall plot looks kind of like this. It's a speaker type thing. And what this waterfall plot would show you is, here's a bunch of peaks and bumps and things. It's the frequency response. And as time continues, you see the snapshot of this frequency response at various time sections. So this is showing a resonance in the low frequency, and it kind of hangs on, and as you continue seeing the waterfall stuff die away to flatness, this continues on, and that shows you that this particular sound is resonating. It's sustaining longer than it should. Whereas with an NS10, what you've got is its annoying little NS10 acts more like this, where you've got its funny frequency response and stuff, but it happens to die off real quick for a variety of reasons, and then it's kind of gone. If you monitor stuff through a speaker system of any kind, like Oratones and things can be kind of like that too. Sealed boxes are like that. And the waterfall plot means that the sound won't continue to persist. It will be easier to mix stuff because you're not getting a sort of built-in reverb at certain frequencies, which is what you get with typical speakers. In particular, what this is a frequency response that would normally roll off kind of like this, but this speaker would have a bass reflex port. And the port is contributing to loudness. It'll cause the bass to be louder at this point, which is down in the lower frequencies, and then it'll also fall off twice as fast after that point. And the problem with bass reflex ports is they resonate, or if they're not resonating, they're not doing much good, because that's where all the amplitude comes from. So they have this like sustaining quality to it, and that's the last thing you want when mixing. And that is why an NS10 is good for mixing. It's not because it sounds bad. The fact that it is really hot in mid-range where we can easily hear sounds is, I suppose, part of it, but it's mostly about the speaker shutting up really fast once you're done. And I have a different kind of acoustic filling inside it. It's a little more empty, and rather than having fiberglass or something in there, what I have is large-sized plastic bubble wrap is what I found to be a good way of dissipating energy inside something that could be resonant, because there's more space inside it for waveforms to, it compresses in a more springy way than fiberglass. But the motion of the air physically moves the sort of clear vinyl bubble wrap stuff, and that physical friction does effectively dampen sound vibrations. So I did that. I put, what's the name of that car panel damping material? It's this metal stuff with sort of tar on the inside of it, and it's not Frost King, that's the foam stuff. And whatever the hell the name of it is, I put that on the insides of the NS10 panels, so the panels are now more damped also. And the woofer has a thin stripe of aluminum tape on it just to sort of break up the behavior, although there's another thing about the NS10s that I will also show you, and it is this. A normal speaker might have its voice coil and its cone like this, and the contour of the cone might be a sort of tapered shape like that, which causes it to project sound in a particular way. Dynamat, yes, exactly, Bo has it. NS10s are interesting in that not only is the NS10 woofer cone exactly a thin paper cone, and this is not the most desirable thing for certain kinds of sound qualities, but it's very good for aggressively making mid-range sounds that then die away really fast. It resonates in a different way than the more contoured cone that you'd have. NS10 cone is purely conical shaped, and it's lighter. The white stuff is lighter than paper cones usually come, but the NS10 cone is also a folded cone rather than made on some kind of mold like this. So what you get is a seam. And this is always the case with the NS10, is it's been cut out of a piece of paper, heavy paper, and turned around until it is a cone shape, and then it's glued there. And the fact that there is the glue seam there changes the resonance of the cone completely. And what I've done is I also take a thin piece of aluminum tape, and by that I mean about as thin as the point of this pen. We're talking really, really skinny. And do a stripe down the back of the cone, because aluminum is a different kind of material. And aluminum with an adhesive on the back is going to serve as a damping material. Because the way damping works, if you have a surface, and then you have a material that is rigid, or even semi-rigid, like any kind of material, and then some kind of adhesive between the two things, it is going to suppress vibrations in the one thing. It's almost like if you were sticking something onto the surface of a cymbal, and then the cymbal doesn't resonate anymore. You can put tape on a cymbal to cut its sustain way down. That's often done on ride cymbals, for instance. You would think that that was a horrible idea, because it's like, oh, now it sounds like a trash can lid, but in the mix it might be very helpful. So anytime you have bands where the drummer is either a hired gun or is just very impressed by the wisdom of the band leader, and the band leader says, you should do this because your cymbal is ringing so much and it's annoying me, then they may very well stick sticky tape all over their cymbals to make them be damped. So several people have mentioned several things, so I'll get right on that. Bo, since I was talking about the NS10 things, The bubble wrap does work as a air cushion, but mostly what it's doing is providing a sort of weight, because bubble wrap is not weightless stuff. So if you have a enclosure with your speaker inside, and it is just completely empty, sound waves from the back of the speaker will bounce around inside there like it's a room. It has its own little reverb chamber. If you fill it with fiberglass, you have this dense pile of stuff that has to be physically moved out of the way by the airwave moving to the edge of the enclosure. And so you got to push that out of the way with the air pushed by the speaker. This restricts the freedom with which the speaker can move backwards, because it's like anytime a sound wave is pushing back against something, there's going to be a certain amount of reflection, and the reflection will then inhibit the speaker from moving farther. And if you have a enclosure that's densely filled with fiberglass, it will in fact fool the speaker to think the cabinet is larger, because it's providing this sort of weight that the speaker also has to swing. The speaker will move inwards, and then it'll have to push this internal fill stuff along with it. And for that reason, it'll be slowed down initially, and that's not necessarily desirable. And then as it continues to have energy fed into it and pushes the air out of the way and pushes the filling out of the way, that filling will develop a sort of momentum because it has weight to itself. I've been building speakers for decades, so I can go forever on this. Kick me if I get too boring about it. And then when your speaker is reaching its maximum swing, that inner filling is still moving away from the speaker, the direction that the speaker is going. So it'll keep going for a while. It'll have some inertia to it. Under most circumstances, you can still do other weird things. And that'll kind of pull the speaker along with it, and that's what makes it seem as if the cabinet is larger. Not much larger. There's nothing you can do in this way that'll make the cabinet seem like 5 times as large. Possibly excepting this old trick, which is isobaric woofers. If you had your speaker and the one was sort of going this way, and then you had a whole other speaker out of phase bolted onto the front of the first speaker, and it was also pushing that way, you have the same basic effect. But instead of just having the inner filling, which is always going to vibrate, everything vibrates in a speaker. The walls vibrate in a speaker, much less the filling. You've got a whole separate speaker driver that is attempting to move in the same direction, and that's an even more effective way of causing that effect. Now, the thing about isobaric, yes. The thing about what I'm doing with the bubble wrap is like this. You probably can't see, but I'm sketching again. I like to do it kind of like this. That's 3 walls. I would probably be doing the 4th too. There is a layer of this plastic bubble wrap that is like a kind of wall. It's also like a limp mass acoustic loading. And the bubbles are typically much lighter and fluffier. And then the backing of it tends to be heavier. It's heavy enough that it'll have an acoustic effect and it'll interfere with the sound rather than not interfering at all. But it's definitely so light that it's not going to impede the waveforms moving around. And if waveforms are coming from the speaker and bouncing here and there, very quickly, the amount of loading that is happening from the sound waves bouncing around will damp out because they're being forced to go through this layer of limp vinyl mass loading that is mounted on a bunch of extremely flimsy plastic bubbles. And interestingly, rather than being rigid, because there's a problem with things like this being overly rigid too. And that's one of the reasons that NS10s also sound good, is a failure to be utterly rigid. When it's this limp stuff that doesn't have any rigidity and can't be solid, it's just kind of loose in there. And the sound waves will crinkle up the bubbles and the backing as they pass through. And that is enough of a physical distortion that if you take bubble wrap and crinkle it in your hands, it'll actually make a audible noise. The noise that is making is a very high degree of damping because it's being turned into aggressive physical distortion of a thing. And basically, you have a lot of leverage in an arrangement like this to take a acoustic wave and turn it into heat through the wrinkling and manipulation of this plastic stuff. And technically, yeah, exactly. It is dampening the sound wave by turning it into heat through wrinkling the vinyl. And it's not likely to be happening at a loud enough level where you can hear the kind of high frequency crinkling that is being produced by this, for two reasons. One of them is it's a lot quieter than the speaker, which is in front of all that. And two is that's a high frequency sound. This rustling, crunkling of the bubble wrap sound is a high frequency sound, and the speaker is heavy, and high frequency sounds have a hard time getting through a large paper cone. So basically that works pretty well. And the problem with doing this kind of thing, and say, if you made them out of titanium and you had holes cut in the backing so that it was essentially sound going through a hole will also generate heat from the air heating up as it gets squeezed through the little hole. And that is another effective way of damping. It's maybe not the most effective way of damping, but there's an element of that is also happening with the fiberglass filling. Now, the problem there is when you have rigid materials will tend to resonate. So the most rigid material you could possibly have might be kind of springy. So you would essentially have the material inside there ringing like a cymbal. And that is nobody's friend. It's no good. I'm going to get to Tony's observation in a moment. And then I'll have to scroll up because there were other questions. Now, one of the things about excuse me, Tony's question, relative to the fiberglass filled kind, I think that using bubble wrap along the inside walls, and it has to be the right kind. I like using bubbles about yay big so that it's really spaced off somewhere, because you need to be fairly far away from the wall. The thing about that is that if you have a densely filled fiberglass filled thing, high frequency range, the speaker is going to be the same either way. However, effectively, the speaker is coupled to the filling, especially when you're really close to the speaker. If you don't have a airspace behind it and it's just fiberglass right up against the speaker, that's going to maximize the lowering of the resonant frequency. And it's also going to maximize damping, and that's good. But you're acoustically coupling the driver to the wrapping, to the filling. That means increasing the weight of the cone. And for little tiny vibrations, The cone's going to be able to do that because there's no time for the vibration to go and reach the weighting factor. But if you needed to do a sudden aggressive motion, like a high frequency resonance, one of the things that I always like, which is, never just get rid of resonances everywhere, because maybe some of your waveforms might benefit from having really high amplitude, mid-range, or high frequency sounds. Like you might want to have a high note, a synthesizer note, a vocal note, or something that just goes right through you, suddenly very, very loud, and then it dies away fast. If you have airspace inside here, it's able to go to a higher amplitude because there is not the heavy acoustically coupled fiber fill or whatever in there being dragged along by the speaker. And if you had like this bubble wrap kind of thing, there's a lot of airspace in here, and it's actually not damping it nearly as hard. And if you had complete no damping inside whatsoever, you'd have maximum ability to produce resonant sonorous noises and like loud high notes that were very spectacular. Wow, it goes right through me. That was that snare drum really hit super hard, the clang. But it would also sustain a long time, much like the waterfall plot here. You'd have a sustained thing going through here. You'd have resonant notes that weren't supposed to be there, and that would start getting in the way. So it's this balancing act between how much do I suppress the backing radiation of the speaker in this acoustic cavity that we don't want sound coming back out again, and how much do I let it like propagate freely. And this is one of the reasons why certain kinds of speaker designs, let me show you one of them. I've seen this. I've been meaning to attempt to make one like this. Doing a little quick sketch here. I've seen a speaker built kind of like that. Or you could also have three back. This is a single driver. And then there's four other drivers facing the opposite direction behind it. And the one that's facing forwards with the small dot, which is the voice coil, is in phase. And then the ones behind it are out of phase. And there is no enclosure. This is a figure 8 speaker. Oh, hey, thanks, David. David says, console, it rocks. I'm glad that it rocks for people. I've seen people do this. You can buy this, and it'll cost you about $50,000, because when people do these kinds of things, usually they make them cost infinite quantities of money so that people will think that it's more impressive. What's going to happen with something like this is you're going to have your speaker driver just as if you had a speaker driver sort of all by itself in free air. And that is going to produce audio waveforms. The stuff that is pointing forward at you is going to be nice and clear, at least if it's directly on axis, it's pointed directly at your ear. And then the wave behind it is going to go the other direction, bounce off of your back wall, and become acoustic reverberation. And stuff that is literally to the side is going to cancel out, and it's not going to involve the room, it's not going to involve much of anything. The problem becomes that your ability to make low frequencies through an arrangement like this is wildly affected. Like if you take a speaker and start playing music through it without it being in an enclosure, immediately you're losing all the bass and probably all the lower mid-range as well. And you're only hearing upper mid-range and highs. And that's about the size of it. So people have tried to work around this. Like for this one that I'm showing you, that is a little sketch, those would be like 12 or 15-inch drivers just by themselves in free air. And there's the configuration of them in the back. That's like 4 15-inch drivers. That is a amount of cone area that is just hilariously huge. And it's all firing forwards as essentially a figure 8 It's a figure eight woofer. It's a crazy idea, but if you're exactly on axis, it kind of almost works. It's limited by the size of the enclosure. Like if you continued and just made this array of giant speakers and just all the speakers ever, there. Central speaker, speakers out of phase pointing backwards, and then a whole arrangement of more speakers also pointing backwards. And they're all making a waveform that's going in the same direction. The low frequency limit that you're going to hit is related to the size of this array, like how far across it is. And to get down to really serious bass frequencies like 40 or 30 hertz, it's going to have to be like 6 to 12 feet wide. And that becomes kind of ridiculous. But that's what you get for trying to make a figure eight speaker driver. The advantage to doing something like that, to doing a crazy thing like that, is now you don't have a box. Your back wave of your driver is not going into a box to bounce around and then reflect immediately back out the speaker again. Because remember, a speaker is not acoustically transparent. It has to be kind of light to work. So the sound that's bouncing around inside the box is going to come out the speaker. And if you have bass ports, it's going to come out the bass ports even more so. And none of the stuff that's bouncing back out of the speaker is good. It's all bad. All of the stuff bouncing around and coming into the back range is all undesirable. It all hurts. It's all bad. And this is what brings us to one of the details around the NS10. If you have a big heavy walls on your speaker, so they're incredibly sturdy, that's like 2-inch thick mahogany or maple or something, that is much more resistant to the walls flexing, but it will still resonate. And it's a large surface area. And when panels resonate, the amount of interference that you get from them, the amount of sound that you get off of them, is related firstly to how much they're resonating, so you can damp them. It's how rigid they are, so it also matters as to how far away they're going to vibrate based on the air pressure inside. And you can do things like take a cross brace, for instance. You put this cross brace inside the speaker, and that's going to affect the sound of it as well. That's something that you can do with actually existing speaker drivers that you've got. If you can take the speakers off and put wooden or metal cross braces inside them, you're going to be altering the sound. But you're also going to be raising the resonant frequency of the panels that you're bracing. Because rather than having the whole thing just vibrating as a single big panel, now you've got multiple smaller areas that are vibrating in whatever way they're able to. Like you brace it exactly 1/3 of the way down and 2/3 of the way down. That 1/3 space is free to vibrate as much as it wants. And that's a much higher frequency. And higher frequencies are more audible. So the problem with making really rigid drivers can be, or really rigid speaker enclosures, can be that it'll produce worse sound because you'll wind up having these overtones that are right up where it's easy to hear them. And the more rigid the thing is, the longer those frequencies will resonate as well. Getting back to the waterfall plot, you're going to have another one of those things where, like, right up where you can hear them, there is a resonant frequency that sustains a really long time. That's about the worst kind of thing you could have. There have been, I think there were some British speakers, perhaps Tenoys, that were noted for having rather large boxes, but the walls of the boxes weren't unusually heavy. They were oddly light. And the way that basically works is you got your box, You got your speaker, which is not all that large compared to the box. And the box is capable of containing the back wave fairly well, so it's able to have bass. But the frequencies coming out of the speaker behind it, first of all, there's more space there so that they can produce, rather than being a really tiny box that's just stuffed with padding, it's possible to have more airspace if the box is larger. So that gives the speaker more ability to project loud sounds and like suddenly make loud sounds and then stop again. But the largest box that is also not the most rigid solid thing, it's fairly light walls, is going to resonate at lower frequencies that are farther away from, say, 1K or so. And if the box is designed well, these resonations can kind of cancel each other out and interfere with each other. They don't have to ring like a bell. Instead, they can kind of go thud, come off like a drum or something like that, and a drum that dies away fairly quickly. If you design the panels of the box and brace them properly and do interesting enough things with that, it's very possible to make a lightish enclosure that can still enclose low frequencies. Because here's the catch with doing that. You can make it so that all your resonant frequencies are transposed down to where they're not obnoxious. But then the largest size of the panel is able to bow out and not contain the pressure. And the more it does that, the more it cancels out the ability of the speaker to go down to really low frequency noises. It'll be as if you were having the open baffle, like this design again. At a sufficiently low frequency, if the panel can deform to allow just as much space in the internal volume of the thing as the speaker was displacing, you effectively have no speaker at that frequency. It becomes essentially nothing. And there's even some interesting sidelines on that. Like I mentioned that if the panels are being deformed by the pressure inside the speaker, and it deforms so much that it's expanding outwards at the same amount that the speaker is going inwards, that's essentially having no enclosure. But you can make things where no enclosure still gives you bass frequencies. It just makes it become a figure-8 radiator. And a figure-8 radiator produces basically no sound on the sides, but it'll produce in-phase sound forwards and reverse phase sound bouncing off the back wall. So it's still producing bass, it's just made the bass more directional. This is why some of these physical transducer designs are so interesting, is because it really, you can really get deep. You can get into like, can I design a speaker that has a woofer and an enclosure where the woofer and the panel radiations of the enclosure turn it into a figure-8 speaker below a certain frequency. But since you've got the front panel and there's a certain amount of delay time to the back wall, instead it's narrowing the radiation pattern so that instead of having purely a figure-8 radiator, it's sort of a cone radiator pointing forwards, meaning that the low frequencies don't want to bounce off of floors and walls, and your early reflections are going to be more the direct radiation from the driver and not off-axis stuff from the driver. Basically, you're focusing it down so that it's like almost hypercardioid, but for bass. It's just a lot of stuff going on with that. And these are very interesting things. I started out wanting to build speaker designs. In fact, that's what the name Airwindows comes from. That it's being able to design speakers that worked like an open window that you could reach through, rather than speakers that are like, oh, this is a pane of glass in which you observe the music behind the glass and there's a little glare on it or whatever, which is an analogy that high-end audio people often use. Let me scroll up a bit because I have gone off on that and possibly missed a bit Oh, and horn speakers. I have built horn speakers. So, modified NS10s. This entire rant came out of answering this observation. And no, I didn't tame the mid-peak, but I kind of tamed it a little bit, I think. I'm not sure that maximizer plugins are always a good thing. As far as the what do you think a good maximizer plugin to get is concerned, I make various Loudinator plugins. In fact, it might be worthwhile for me to put a special category on my website dedicated to like these ones can do that. But these days, listening to stuff on the internet, many places that you'll have your music heard can be putting in automatic gain control. And if it's automatic gain control, you're getting no benefit out of maximizing the volumes of things, assuming that it's volume we're talking about, because you'll make it be as loud as humanly possible, and then iTunes or whatever will turn you down by default, and or YouTube will turn you down by default, and you'll have accomplished nothing. So there's a sweet spot to hit as far as loudness is concerned. And in some ways, it's just as well to not be thinking about that at all and go for natural mix balances. How many channels would we need to be mixed through Console 6 for it to become noticeable? You could mix 2 sine waves, add enough of an amplitude, and have it become so noticeable that it was completely screwed up. Like if you put 2 sine waves at nearly full scale through, you would wind up going into super huge amounts of distortion. So technically you hardly need any channels, and it becomes a matter of gain staging it. We're going to get into the Console 6, obviously. Patrick is mixing on Genelec and Sennheiser HD800s. One possible danger with Genelecs is that they will tend to make stuff sound good. And in mixing, you don't always want to have stuff be made to sound good, because it could be lying about what you're actually getting. Or doing like, say, I showed this picture of the waterfall plot. If you had a high frequency thing going on that was in a nice useful place, like, I don't know, 10, 11K or something, airband basically, and you had high frequency transducers that did that and then ring a little bit. And the thing with the NS10 tweeters is that they are so blindingly bright, they kind of break up and distort, so it's very easy to get highs loud enough through those that they sound super obnoxious. If the highs over NS10 tweeters sound okay, it's because you're avoiding doing anything too annoying. Whereas very high quality speakers can absorb stuff like that without making it sound nasty and distorty. And stuff that has resonances that are euphonic, that sound nice, will tend to make everything sound comparably nice. You're adding a little bit of glitter to anything that you do, and then you can't tell whether your mix has the glitter or not. And that's why to choose unflattering mixing stuff. I'm not saying that Genelec is bad. I just know that as a brand and stuff, what familiarity I have with them, which is not very great, is like, oh yeah, those sound great. They're really accurate. It's possible that sometimes they sound too great and that you can get fooled by them into thinking that your mix or whatever is nicer than it is, because they are forgiving. They are not going to make your mix sound completely horrible if you make the slightest mistake. Instead, something will go on. And that brings me to the topic of headphones. Because with headphones, here's kind of what happens. Let's say we've got a mix and it's like information here. And you've got this sound. This could be a frequency response chart, or it could be an instant, and you've got this noise, you've got sound, Got sound coming up here, noises all over the spectrum. And then you've got this one place where this tiny little sound comes up just for an instant, and it's very tightly focused, and it's just super loud. And this is what your mix is doing. Most of it is sitting there being well behaved. And, here's some reverb down here. And you've got this little noise happening. And the noise goes beep just for an instant. If you are listening in speakers, what you're going to get is a waterfall plot in the actual room. And that little noise is going to echo and reverberate, and all of your audio is going to do the waterfall plot thing, and you're going to hear it reverberating around. But the little tick that was almost not there, incredibly brief, it's very loud, but it's gone almost immediately. That is going to be sustaining itself through the room a little bit. If you have, say, diffusion in the room, because I was also being asked about diffusion, it will be echoed and broken up in interesting ways so that it's not a comb filtery like twang. It's not going to have that kind of bad flanger effect where it just goes honk. But it will still be echoing around. Diffusion is not the same thing as damping. If you damp it, let me go in the opposite direction for it. You'll have it sustaining, but the sustain will go away much faster. And then if you have headphones, there's your noise, and that is the sustain. Oh wait, there isn't any sustain because they're just only headphones. It's only the transducers ringing that you're going to hear. But as far as echoing in the room, as far as being in an acoustic space, that brief little noise that you would be expecting to hear sustaining into a reverb, sustaining into an acoustic environment, is just instantly gone. So what will happen when you're mixing on headphones is you can do very cool things and very interesting stuff, and you'll get a real spotlight. You'll be able to hear literally everything in the mix, even more than the best of speakers. But it can fool you. You'll have something, you're like, oh yeah, this seems good, and then you listen to it on the speakers, and it's like, whoa, what's this thing all of a sudden? And it's because some little noise was in there, and it was louder than you thought it was because it was brief. And that's a very common thing, like attack transients of things, resonances and sonorities, whatever. All that kind of stuff can make it so that the experience of listening on the headphones is wildly different from listening in any speaker or any room, just because it gives you that capacity to put across extremely loud, high amplitude, extremely brief sounds, and then have them be gone instantly. It's like speakers are the ultimate NS10, but without an actual room in them. I'm pretty sure that if you had your NS10s, which are supposed to be good mix speakers, and you put them in an anechoic chamber, in some ways they'd be even better, and in some ways it would not be good, because you wouldn't have enough context. The speakers are able to make the brief sounds that die away quickly, but then if you don't have the acoustic space for them to be in, then you're not getting all the feedback that you might otherwise have. You need to be able to hear, and your ears need to be able to register what's going on actually in there, whether the sounds be brief or sustained. So yeah, let me keep going here. Compositing, yep. And again, I'm going to reiterate, as far as the Bose comment here, the sound wave slows down as they literally push the mess, which is the filling, out of the way. You have to have very rigid stuff in there. Like I think B&W have indeed done stuff like that. Cells which are very rigid honeycomb structures and stuff. And that's very cool stuff, but the danger is that it'll resonate. Got into diffusion. tuning the bubbles to lots and lots of different frequencies is exactly the sort of thing that would be fun to try. And onwards, I think we're now open to an additional layer of questions. Getting on close to an hour in. And I'm glad that people are learning loads, because this is just the stuff that I like to do. This is why I'm doing the live streams in the first place, is I can be drawn onto all of these different conversations. Did I build Klipsch-like ones? You know, I will take a moment and show you what I built. I'm going to scamper off just for a second, because I believe I know where I put these. In fact, I didn't have to go as far as I thought I would. I had my little tiny models just in the other room. So I built these. They go in the corners of the room. They're about 6 feet tall. This is a tiny little model of them. These are horn-based line array speakers, and the way they work, they're made out of giant, huge sonotubes, like for casting giant buildings or whatever. It cost a couple of $100 to get sonotubes of this size, and they're not easy to manage, and you sure don't want them to get rained on or they become trash instantly. And I made this shape out of them. And the inside, this slot down the center, is speaker drivers pointing into each other and bolted together, firing into the slot and spaced out by nuts against the cardboard of the inner wall. There are some problems with the design, but it does actually work out. Because the back wave is going into this funny looking squished shape, and there's not a lot of space in here, and that's something of an issue. But it does enclose the space fairly well. It just expands outwards like this. This will happen as you compress the air inside, is the whole thing will vibrate and shake. But I built these, and this center part, I've also had ones where you can almost see where it was there. There was an additional layer of this cardboard material making this top area a square cornered horn that's essentially a spherical expansion horn with a tweeter driver on the back firing in. And yes, they are. Toilet rolls are great for working on sonotube designs, because if you can make them out of these, then you can get the larger kind at like Home Depot or wherever, or even these still huger kind from construction companies, and then make those. But I worked out like whether the basic shape would work using these. So yeah, I built these. They are upstairs in my drum room. They're so large that they function as sort of room dividers, as it were. And because there is a whole bank of drivers up and down here, they're very small drivers, but the whole thing will handle about 1,600 watts, most likely. So they can become very, very loud. Although since they're also a line array, they're like line arrays in that they project rather than being deafeningly loud up close. So all in all, like if I was to start up a nightclub, these would be, I would just bring them down and I'd install them in the nightclub, and it'd be like, okay, now I have my mid-range all taken care of. And probably put a really powerful tweeter horn up where the top is, and it's like, okay, now I have my high frequencies all taken care of. And I'd probably have to come up with bass bins for the very bottomest of octaves. But, yep, I built those. They're still functional. I haven't taken them apart and stripped them for drivers yet or anything like that. Technically, I could even sell them or let somebody have them, but they're so cumbersome to move around. I've moved them from one place to another. I moved into this house and I moved them into the house, and oh my God, that was so hard to do. That was brutal. So Jolie asked quickly, is it true the slew function has been done away with in Console 6? Console 6 is... twang! Console 6 is the equivalent of purest Console 5. Console 6 does not use the slew function. It's such an exaggerated function that it would start becoming really weird. And that's also the function that was giving me DC offset problems. So Console 6 does not have the slew function, does not have that sound effect, and does not generate DC issues, or those kind of problems that made Console 5 so difficult to manage in some cases. You can run sawtooth waves into Console 6 and they will be fine, and so on and so forth. That's not to say that I can't come up with a way of doing it. I just haven't come up with a way of doing it that really solves cases like the sawtooth waves and stuff. And modern DAW mixing so often includes virtual instruments and synthesizers and stuff that that's kind of a major oversight. There's a reason that I left the slew function out of Console 6 in the absence of having a really good solution for that, which is, it's so much of a problem with certain kinds of waveforms that I really couldn't use it. But it's not to say that I won't include it in some other way. What I'll be doing when I start combining this with bus colors is coming up with different ways to shape the sound that will not cause that problem. And I'm pretty confident about that. Although I suppose it's always a matter of, I can try it out and find out whether anything weird happens. And if so, I guess we'll all find that out. So let's see now. Now scroll up a teeny bit and go, Bo is absolutely correct that the right horn speaker in the right room is a joy. And I'll tell you why. Because sonority is nice. Because amplitude and having large peaks is nice. The whole thing about horn speakers, the whole thing about having something like a giant monster like this, and these are placed in the corners of the room too, is that it's capable of taking the waves from the speaker and turning them to really high amplitude sound waves that just hit you really hard and very quickly. And the way that horn speakers make these loud sounds, it is also capable of dying away rather quickly as well. So it's a very good example of the quick, extremely high amplitude sound. That's kind of the whole deal, is the efficiency of horn speakers. And this is why I keep basically shit-talking Soothe and stuff like that when I'm being asked, you need to make me stuff where it can cut down resonances. I'm like, no, resonances are your friend. With horn speakers, the stuff that is going to be the most impressive is stuff with lots of resonances that are musically appropriate resonances, and they're part of the music. Because those are the ones where it's like, oh my God, that trumpet note went right through me. And it went right through you because it's 48 dB higher than you were expecting it to be. And completely undistorted, completely uncompressed. There's not a bunch of additional distortion being put on it. Instead, it's, you got a 800 hertz note or a 2.3K harmonic, and it's going zang. All of a sudden, it's 140 dB, but it's not distorting, which produces, even in air, even if you're doing it in a actual speaker, if you go with 140 dB harmonic on something and then you distort it, it's going to cause higher harmonics. And the higher harmonics irritate the ear and are plainly audible, just like when you have it in digital and they're aliasing. Anytime you distort, whether it is in electrically, digitally, or physically, in the acoustics of actually moving a cone or a driver, because the whole thing about horn speakers is transmitting the sound to the outside air in a more efficient way than you would have with just a free air speaker cone. If you're able to produce such high amplitude sound by the impedance matching with the air that the horn does, then you're capable of putting out these very, very loud, brief, accurate, high frequency or mid frequency noises that don't generate harmonics, that aren't distorting, that aren't generating higher frequency stuff. And that sounds good to people. It sounds good when you've got like a person who is singing and the note that they hit happened to have a harmonic at, say, 4.1K and 2.05K, and it just happened to be really loud for an instant at those notes, but, they're not a stomp box, they're not an electric device, so there's no clipping on their voice necessarily. They're projecting. They're really, they're using their diaphragm. And as such, the acoustic experience of that is this sudden, grabby, gripping, very interesting, loud musical sound, and it doesn't have a bunch of like 6K and 10K and 12K and 18K as distortion being added to it. So that's, again, more about why I think resonances can be your friend. And often the last thing you want to do is, this is why I made ResiQ. ResiQ reduces sounds to only a few resonant bands and whacks everything else. So it's like it tries to force stuff into that resonant, impressive performance kind of thing where you're getting these mid-range things and then everything else is very pure. So, Yuri, that's not a stupid question at all. That's an interesting question. So here's the deal. When you're running a square wave through headphones, the headphones are not going to immediately react because there's physical limitations in what you're seeing. And I bet I can draw what you describe. Like here is that's a square wave. And what you're describing is kind of like this. It lags. And what's going on with that is simply the transducer can't move that fast. And it might even be desirable. Because one thing that will happen is if you have a transducer that is so rigid that it can move as fast as this, meaning that if you fed more energy into it, what we would get out would be sort of a reduced amplitude version of that, but it would be the same sharpness of the edges. If it had perfect rigidity, you'd probably get something like this. Like these curves can be your friend in a sense, because what's going on there is the membrane in the headphone is not resonant in the same way that, say, a titanium tweeter dome or, a cymbal, a bronze plate would be. It's nothing like as rigid. It's like a plastic membrane. But as it's slow to react, it's not storing up all that much energy that needs to vibrate. Whereas if you have a very rigid dome, you can get a sharper edge, but then it's going to overshoot. It's going to ring. Just the same as it would in digital or in electrical. In acoustic, physical objects, the same thing will happen. In fact, the more rigid the object is, the more intense the resonance will be, and this is the last thing you want. This is not your friend. So there's a balance between having it be so soft that it's just not representing high frequencies at all, or having it be rigid enough that it's a little bit of overring on there. But it's always going to be a thing where the steeper you get these angles, the more oscillation, the more ring you're going to have with it, just by virtue of needing to use more and more rigid materials to do it. It's very much the same thing as doing digital filters and trying to get a steeper pass band to stop band transition zone. The steeper you make that, the more you start getting these waveforms, because it's actually the shape of a square wave, is a band limited square wave. Always does this. That's what the shape of a band limited square wave is. If you put a brick wall filter on it, then you take away those higher harmonics, and that's the shape that you get. It's going to have a certain amount of slant, and it's going to have that shape on the top and bottom of it, at both edges, actually, because that's literally what the shape is of a square wave with the highest harmonics taken away. The only way to not have that is to have it be infinite harmonics, and that's not physically possible, or electrically possible, or digitally possible. It's always going to be a compensating factor. So for that reason, the headphone membrane roll-off, where you see that it's softened in that way, isn't necessarily all bad, because it's stopping it from having those high-frequency resonances, which are kind of less desirable. Also, the if it's more of a triangle-y shaped wave, or it's like a ramp wave and the tops of it are angled, that is low frequencies not being contained adequately. And if you have better isolation, better earpiece cups, so that you're isolating the driver and letting it be more like a, in theory, if you wanted to have a perfectly flat square wave at any frequency that you wanted, you would need to have extremely good earpiece cups that didn't let any sound through, because this is basically another push-pull radiator. It's a figure-8 radiator. One of it side is going into your ear. The other side is going to wrap around it and come around the outside edges. I've got some headphones that are kind of like that, and they're sort of like drummer headphones. They're actually built out of sort of firing range. They're the kind, they're very expensive. They're not the Vic Firth ones. They're the white colored ones. And they're these hard plastic things, and the earpieces are like gel or something in there. And it has extremely good isolation between the front wave and the back wave of the driver. But they're not super comfortable to wear, so it's all a balancing act, really. Yeah, early reflections do come a bit later than direct sound, and horn speakers are more directional. So horn speakers, depending upon how they go, like something like this, a spherical expansion horn, has fairly decent off-axis response, but you're always going to get a lot more directionality from a horn driver than from just a driver in free air. And that is one thing that helps. It means that the raw output of the driver is going to go more directly to you, and especially the highs are not going to bounce off all of the early reflections nearly as much. It's going to fire directly at you, bounce off the back wall, and then go from there. So Tony asks, can I compare PD console with console 6? Kinda. The thing with PD console is it's the console 5 algorithm, and that is less obvious than console 6, but it's the purest drive algorithm at the same time. So that has a kind of softening effect technically I could probably do a version of that where it was trying to do the same algorithm onto console 6. That's something that could also be done by just using Purist Drive. I'm not sure, although I suppose I could experiment and find out. I'm not sure that it would stand to gain all that much just from taking the Purist Drive algorithm and implementing a console 6 algorithm that uses the, like, this is the last sample, this is the basic slew rate that we're doing, this is how much this affects the, Purist Drive is a neat little algorithm, but I'm used to it working with essentially the console 5 arrangement, sort of the sine-based thing. Why do I need a flipboard? T.H. Wath, I've gone through these and look at how many I've got left. I have all the paper I want, so we can cover a lot of more stuff if needed. One thing I do need, however, is a new shirt. I'm not wearing the heavy monk robe kind of thing because it is no longer winter, and so it's no longer cold in here. But this shirt is ill-chosen and not as good as the one that I do for the videos because, look, it doesn't fit. It's a short-sleeve shirt now. Yep, the guy that was doing the Console 6 thing was originally doing something with shaders. It's not necessarily images. GLSL shaders is a video game thing, if I'm not mistaken. And so that's working with graphics cards, and it's making computer graphics look better. Yuri, as far as the construction headphones, yeah, that's definitely how you make isolation headphones. And that's pretty much how that works out. Like the ones that I got are basically those special purpose construction headphones or shooting headphones. They're just, noise suppression, and they look like it. They look like they have white pillows on the outside of these earpieces, and they're hard plastic. And basically all they did was they put a little panel in there and put a Sony 7509 or something like that headphone driver in there. And that's all that is. It's very expensive, but that's all that is they took an existing gun range and construction site earmuffs that are very, very high efficiency earmuffs and just stuck some drivers in there. So Lefevre Debal has a question. I'm going to scan upwards a little bit and go, okay, I think I covered that. So Lefevre, you need to tell me a little bit more about that. I've got some time to think about this. So I'll be here for another 40, 50 minutes or so. So you got to explain a little bit about this release implementation. I might be able to tell you why, but you got to show me. Well, here's the thing. I'm talking about Bo's question now. I don't know exactly what this GLSL shader was doing, so I can't answer that question. What I do know is that in shaders, what you're essentially doing is going like, okay, graphics card, here is a texture, here's another texture, here is a way to map this texture to the output buffer of the video card, and we're going to draw this texture angled and tilted over here and put this lighting on it. So they have to do all kinds of stuff with regard to, like, if the light goes from 0 to 1 and the texture is over here and you're convolving the texture by the light amount, but the angle of the thing is like this, except for there's Fresnel on the thing, so it's at a sharp angle, and then that becomes more bright again. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in game programming and in video programming, but it would not be the same as what I'm doing in audio, which is why I was handed an algorithm that had the essential guts of what I needed, but it wasn't implemented in such a way. Like a fellow on the Gearslutz thread was talking about this and going, oh yeah, this algorithm, it generates huge amounts of second harmonic. And I'm going like, I know. I had to watch for whether it was positive or negative, the sample, and then do this with it, and then just apply that. And he's like, oh yeah, like this. And he had another way of doing it. And then said, yeah, if you applied that to the other side of the thing, it would get rid of the crackling. And I'm like, actually, no, not really, because I'm not using the other side of the sampling. So you think that that is having any kind of an effect, and it's really kind of not. Instead, this crackling that people are observing, I told you about that already. It's just you have to gain stage to not mix as loud. This is a version of console that distorts when you push it too hard. And it distorts by taking the sound qualities that we consider advantageous, the good part of the audio of console, and exaggerating it until it is unpleasant. Like, you have to treat it as this is the console where you can't mix too hot into it because it will distort. It will overload. And the distorting is not necessarily... It's not making it be a bad sound. It's the same sound that people are liking in smaller amounts. It's just, is it distracting? Is it become too much? Is it interacting well with the particular sound that you're using? Somebody said that they were doing a drum sub mix, and with their drums, they're going like, oh, I've got these drums and this drums and these hi-hats, and it mixed my hi-hats for me. And I'm like, okay, if you say so. But what that means is it was distorting those hi-hats, and it distorted them so hard that it changed the volume of them and suppressed the loudness. I guess that makes the Console 6 potentially forgiving for certain kinds of sounds. But it's the same kind, the crackle is the same thing. That crackle is what was causing the hi-hat to be mixed for him. And he's like, oh, it fixed my hi-hat. Yeah, it applied the crackle to the hi-hat, and that's what the crackle sounds like when used on a hi-hat, is it turned to something good that you liked. If you put a bunch of sine waves up, it's going to start sounding unpleasant again, probably, because it's going to put in stuff that is clearly not part of those sine waves. And it just all depends. It all depends upon what kinds of sound you're throwing into it. And that's what people get used to when they talk about mixing on analog mixers. And it's like, how do we gain stage into the analog mixer? You know, do we slam the bus of the analog mixer? Does it sound good? If you use this like rock and roll SSL mixer or something like that, or if you use this Neve, or if you are a like French house guy and you're using an old Mackie or a tiny Mackie, and the whole thing is like, oh yeah, when I mix into this tiny Mackie, it has an amazing sound when you just make it everything be really heavy and loud. It's that same kind of thing. It's generating some distortion, it's generating crackle, it's generating this interference and unpleasant noises. And when you dial it back, the small amounts of it start having a useful effect, because it's all along the same kind of continuum of that versus the raw DAW mix. And the raw DAW mix is kind of like the raw DAW mix is kind of like trying to do a mix monitoring only using headphones, where it's going to let stuff through completely undistorted that you might not want to be there. And with the headphones, you won't be able to hear it. And with the raw DAW mix, you're going to have to cope with the fact that these things are combining in a way that is unforgiving and just gives you what you put in. Like if you have your hi-hat is obnoxious, and some of your sounds poke out, it's going to layer the obnoxiousness on top of the sounds that are poking out, and everything is going to just become like, okay, this sounds gross now because some of the edges are too harsh, some of the edges are too strong. You mix into something like anything, your tiny Mackie mixer, or the SSL, or something with lots of internal transformers that's very glossy and high class, or a console or something like that. it will resist doing some of those things because it'll distort. It'll be unable to produce the sound you're telling it to produce, and instead it'll produce a sound that is more desirable. And it's just all a matter of like what counts as desirable. What kinds of distortion are you finding suitable? Like being asked for a Console 6 version of Purist Drive Console is essentially the same thing, because all Purist Drive is doing is remembering the previous sample, and then its distortion quality softens a little more than it would otherwise do. It softens and slows things a little more than it would otherwise do, and that's all it's doing. It's doing it in a characteristic way, but there's nothing really more sophisticated about that. It's just like, okay, if we have high frequencies going on, then you distort a little easier, or you transition into the distortion a little softer, and that can sound good to people. And yeah, Patrick, if Console 6 is distorting, you could treat it like there are gain issues, and that could be great for you, for all I know. If it's something where you'd like to be mixing around minus 12 or minus whatever, and peaking only that much, and you use Console 6, it's going to show you, much like Righteous. Righteous has had that going on as well, which kind of implies that I might actually get some mileage out of doing a Console 6 Righteous bus. Combine some of those things together. Maybe that'll be part of the bus colors combination. All depends. I got to have a burst of inspiration and a lot of really strong coffee to get that stuff together. But yeah, Console 6 very much is the case where if it is distorting, you can be patting down the gain a little bit. You can let there be a little more headroom, because it's probably going to behave itself much better if you're not slamming the bus. You will be able to tell when you're slamming the bus using Console 6. So hey, I think I've caught up fairly good. Got some people watching, so if any of you have not been speaking up and have questions, I've still got time for answering them. And I have lots of paper to draw stuff on. So T. Wath is asking, yeah, you have it right, that you add the channel as the last insert on a track, ideally after the fader. And the bus one is the first insert on the summing bus. There can be exceptions, but you don't necessarily want to do them, or at least if you start working with exceptions, it becomes just playtime. Because this is the kind of thing where it's like if you were able to take apart your mixing console and just randomly scramble all the parts. It's a DAW. There's not that much that can break for changing these things around. The worst that'll happen is it'll sound wrong, or not do what it's supposed to do, or produce some kind of weird loud distortion or anything going on. So basically, if you are going to use it as intended, or the way that it would be designed into a dedicated DAW if it was, what you would do is put the channel on post fader and the bus one on pre anything else. Oh, Tony, don't retract that. I was about to answer it. Darn it. And that was going to give me something else to talk about, curses. So anyway, the thing about the post fader thing is that some DAWs don't let you do that, and that is kind of cumbersome. That's why the console plugins have a gain trim on them, because otherwise, if there was no gain trim, then you'd kind of be trapped. You'd have to put a gain plugin in ahead of time, and it isn't really designed to work with trimming. Basically, if you use the fader after the plugin, what'll happen is as you turn down, stuff will become more distorted. And if you push it up, stuff will become more kind of expanded. And these are not necessarily great things. It's kind of, you could kind of get away with it, but not so much. Tony, yes, I should answer that question. I knew that it was a good question. What you should do if you want to use bus colors in Console 6 is put bus colors on after Console 6. That's what you should do. Because the current existing bus colors is not designed to be built in yet. So basically you want to put it outside the console system. And if you want to put the color of bus colors on there, you basically just throw it on afterwards, get the whole convolution thing going. And then if you're not mixing super loud, you're probably not slamming it. But given that with Console 6 you're not going to be peaking to full scale, you can take Console 6, go into Console 6 bus on the beginning of it, then go into bus colors, and if you wanted a louder mix, what you could do is go from there through the Console 6 bus into bus colors, and there you crank the input. So there you're taking what is already a spatially expanded mix. Going into bus colors, you're getting the tonality that you're looking for, and then you also get to distort the peaks and slam it a little bit, but you're not slamming it in a way that is going to interfere with the way Console 6 works. So that's what you do. I knew that it was a good reason for you to ask that question. I'm not sure if I've explained that to anybody yet, but this is what you do. Is bus colors gets treated as a distortion plugin in this context, and you run that as a whole, like as a loudinator stage, like a final limiter or whatever, and then you just push it as far as you like, but it's not going to interfere with the Console 6 algorithm at all. So let me skip around a little bit. Plugin standard for console emulations. No, I can't. And the reason is because, first of all, I keep changing them. And second of all, I think I should change them. Why would you want a plugin standard if you have this kind of algorithm that can do a digital mix bus that actually works like all manner of different kinds of things? Why shouldn't all different DAW makers have their own flavor of whatever if they get into this sort of thing? If they don't, then we'll just have to be plugging them in as plugins. If I started making a DAW, it would, think of it this way. You know how you got Harrison Mixbus? And people are very fond of Harrison Mixbus because it does certain coloration. It makes the sound of the digital console not sound like exactly every other one. Instead, it has its own sound. That's just the sort of thing that we're doing with Console 6 or all the previous consoles. They should be able to come up with their own special sauce. There's so many things you can do. I'm going to be doing this thing with the hybrid bus color console things. And I have some ideas, and once I've done them, they will exist as MIT open source, but I'm going to make it very clear, I took this, input and this tonality, and I changed it in this way, and then I gain staged it so that it starts to hit the console effect at this level. And if somebody decided that they wanted to make things like, I want a rock and roll console, but it has to hit a little bit harder on the transients instead of saturating, and I want it to be a little bit more expandy, but there needs to be a certain amount of grit based on it, and people should be able to do that. There's no reason there should be a standard for how this particular way of combining sounds should exist, because it'd be so much better, whether it's proprietary or open source, whichever. You should be able to have DAWs and ways of working in the box where you find the new one and you're like, wow, this sounds and feels completely different. Because here's the thing. I'm trying to think of the example I thought of. This is something I was thinking of the other day, and it's escaping me at the moment. You know how raw DAW math is very stark and everything's summed mathematically, so it's very unforgiving? Well, I don't remember the exact example I had in mind, But I was thinking of some kind of album that was done in early digital where, and I forget what it was. Here, what I can think of one good example. This is not the one I was thinking of. Donald Fagen's The Night Fly. If you're familiar with that album, you think about that. If you've listened to it, I have a vinyl record of it. In some ways, it's even more appropriate on CD or something. That is a fully digitally everything in the early days of digital, and it just lived digital throughout. And it fits so well with the tones that the guy used, these like very glistening Rhodes and these really well set up drums, and they handled everything super well. They already knew to do things like de-essing so that the highs on the Night Fly are never grating or obnoxious, but it's just so pristine. It's so crystalline and pristine, and it works perfectly. That fits perfectly for that context. So even something like your raw DAW mixing, there's like Autechre is another example where that's like a mathematical music going on. The very sounds themselves are super abstract. And you can have music. Oh, now I remember. The exact example I was thinking of was one of my favorite bands. And the leader of that band is actually somebody who likes some of my work and who were kind of like friends, kind of, sort of. At least I'd like to think so. And it's Beauty Pill, led by Chad Clark. I remember something about, he went and got the album Describes Things As They Are. Beauty Pill Describes Things As They Are, which is a great, great album. Mastered at Emily Lazar's mastering studio. And I have 192K mixdowns of this. I bought sadly I bought it through his previous rip-off record label that ripped them off. So he's currently reselling those now on Bandcamp, and I encourage getting it. But I had these super high resolution masters. And I know, because he's talking about it, that some of the songs on that album were mixed in a fancy pants recording studio, because this, Chad likes using expensive gear for some of his stuff. There'll be like fancy expensive compressors and good microphones and such, and the sounds that he gets can be very expensive, high quality sounds. However, some of those songs were mixed in a big studio with a fancy recording console and stuff, and some of the songs were mixed in his laptop. And he likes to go, it's the music and the needs of the song rather than the gear. Don't get too hung up on the gear, because I don't remember which ones were being done on the laptop and which ones were done in the expensive studio. I also seem to remember him talking about mixing what I think I can safely describe as the hit song Africana Barista in a coffee shop or something, which is kind of like what the point of the song is. But it feels like I remember that as being one of the laptop mixed songs. And the thing about it is Africana Barista is this very grooving, almost like DC hip-hoppy kind of groove going on with interesting offbeats and stuff. But it goes into this zone where there's a lot of stuff going on. It's kind of dense with noise. Hey, Whitesy. And at the end of Africana Barista by Beauty Pill goes into this zone where it blossoms outwards into these horn parts. And he's using actual horn recordings. And he wanted to go for like Coltrane expanding outwards into space or something. It's very abstract. And how that works with what was probably DAW mixing is fascinating. Because if you mix something like that through a big creamy analog console that really avoided the DAW sound, everything would space outwards and sit in a apparent acoustic space. Like if you mix that through console 6 and balanced it properly, what would happen is those horns would sit back a little bit, and each of them would take up their own space, and it would feel like an orchestra. It would feel big. If, as I'm suspecting, that track was just mixed in the DAW, just mixed on a laptop with raw DAW summing, just what you're supposed to not like, Tistrol would be nice. What happens is you get that DAW sound where all the sounds feel like they are parallel to each other against your ears. They combine in such a way that there's no forgivingness to it. And we're talking about a whole bunch of horn tracks. So this blossoming outwards into Coltrane-y like overload and beauty thing in that track works with the DAW summing because it's desirable in that context. It's musically desirable to have it be like, okay, here's all my stuff, and then simultaneously here's a bunch of horns and things, and they're all kind of occupying the same space and just overlapping, and they all feel kind of like they're just against your ear. So this is why I would not have people using a preset ideal concept for console of any kind. You need to have different sounds and different feels, because you never can tell when you'll run across a song like Africana Barista where the quirks of some particular kind of summing, like in that case, DAW summing, which we don't normally consider to be like, wow, that's great, that sounds really good, I really enjoy what that does. In that context, with all those horns playing different stuff and they're kind of going against each other, rather than sitting back into a solid mass that sounds orchestral, they overlap in that sort of DAW-y math kind of way, and they sound kind of hallucinatory, and it's exactly what the song needs. So yeah, I must encourage people to have mixers and new forms of DAW summing each use their own style of doing that kind of thing. It's really kind of important because that's how you get different programs, and some of them could be open source programs. Certainly anybody that wanted to do open source DAWs would be able to use all of my stuff and build it into their DAW so that it's open for people to do. There's open source DAWs that you could run from. Harrison built on, I think, Ardor, just as Electric Owl says. So, go knock yourself out. Basically, I'm just trying to facilitate that. And you'd be making mixers sound different by building that into the actual summing math of the mixer. And in doing that, we'd wind up with programs that really had their own sound and interacted and worked differently. And then you'd be able to put plugins into those, assuming that they accept plugins, and change things even more. Or you could make ones where you couldn't put plugins and it just would tell you like, okay, use this DAW and this is the kind of audio that you get out of it. And just roll with that. Because not everything has to be completely plastic and flexible. Instead, you could have DAWs that are designed to do a particular thing. Like you can have a DAW that is designed like, this is my ambient music DAW. So everything runs through a reverb. Go figure. And do you want to have something that doesn't run through a reverb? Ha, fat chance. It all goes through a reverb. And then you just use that, and it gets a characteristic sound, and that's what you get. So let's scroll down a little bit. White Seas joined us. Don't mind Jolie. Jolie gets to sass me as well. Sometimes you run across people who are just like, you let them, heckle you a little bit, and as long as it isn't too nasty, we're fine. Don't get too carried away with that, though, Jolie. Like, I'll tolerate a certain amount of that stuff. Don't get mean. Yeah, afraid that you did just miss a long explanation about certain things, but it was mostly based on the question of should I take Console 6 that just came out yesterday and make a standard so that all DAW manufacturers should really use that as summing. And I'm like, no, no, don't do that. People should get to do whatever they like. Besides, if you push Console 6 too hard, it distorts, obviously, so you might not want to do that. Now that White Sea is actually here, I do... You haven't sent me any emails that I was missing? Because me and White Sea were talking about something interesting, and this is a fine time to continue that conversation a little bit. We're thinking of getting together away from work, but on the internet, and getting together and playing. And that could be a number of things. I know you mentioned that it would be fun to do something where we got together and did a sort of game streaming thing, in our off time, not replacing anything that we're currently doing, but just some extra thing. I'm not sure whether you had in mind a scheduled repeating thing or just a couple of one-offs or whatever. I could do either. And I have several possibilities with several different ranges of... Well, put it this way. I have been building Minecraft mods. So I have a server that I could turn on basically right now and fire up a client and jump on there, and I'd be able to give the IP address out and start whitelisting people. Or indeed, I could shut off the whitelisting entirely and have everybody in this chat just pile in there and start derping around making stuff or blowing things up. And or we could each do that as, like, if you're a Patreon member, then you get to be on this server. Or if you're a Patreon member spending huge amounts of money, you get to be on this server. We could be really mercenary about it. The one-off things might fit some other ideas rather than that, because what that would be is more like getting a crew together. Jolie, take it easy. Take it easy, dude. You need to understand, I'm one of White Sea's patrons. I'm supporting this dude, so don't be too harsh. I like what he's doing. In any case, the Minecraft thing, I can do a lot of weird stuff with that. Notably, the server that I'm thinking of is, the first one I have in mind at least, is a one that is called Snowball Madness, where there are lots of crazy things that you can do in that, and I have YouTube videos and another channel that outline in great detail what Snowball Mass is about. And the idea with doing something like that is more along the lines of letting people join us and having it become sort of a thriving community, in which if you had people in your fan base that liked playing Minecraft and stuff, they'd probably be really excited to join. And I have not run across many people who have come to me and go, oh yeah, you mentioned that, I'd like to do that. But we both have Discord servers, and Discord servers means that some of you could be talking on the stream as well. Like, this stream is more a... like, I could probably have White Sea jump on the stream in chat, depending upon how we worked it out. But no, we don't agree, Jolie. But I mean, look at the mastering one. Seriously, it's good work. But another possibility that would be more like a one-off. I have seen people. Notably, some other folks, I don't support these guys on Patreon simply because their initial tier is too high. But Loading Ready Run, comedy troupe, did a episode where Graham, one of the leaders of that troupe, and Alex did Kerbal Space Program. Now, if you were looking for snake oil things to do that were kind of on brand, so you could do stuff and it would be a little bit like the kind of the stuff that you do, it would go along with the regular content. Doing a Kerbal stream would be because Kerbal Space Program is the game in which you are building these spaceships with physical modeling in the Unity game engine, and then you blast them off with these goofy little guys inside, and hilarity typically ensues. It gets really ridiculous, but the context I can think of for that, oh, you do know Kerbal Space Program. Well, can't you imagine how cool that would be to be like, okay, so here's the thing is, Chris from Airwindows builds a rocket, and White Sea decides whether it is snake oil and it will take off and work. Or vice versa. And there's some possibilities there. But yeah, all of this, it might not necessarily happen like all that quick, because we both are keeping really... I noticed that White Sea had already released some other kind of video between the time that I last talked with them on email. So these things won't necessarily happen super fast, but we're kind of exploring the idea. And it would be an additional thing to do. And my feeling about it is definitely that, especially with the Minecraft thing, because here's the thing with that. Oh, Weedsy? Okay. I will have to bear that in mind, because I thought that since you used White Sea, that it was going to be pronounced White Sea. But clearly I was mistaken. Remember that. I'm always a little concerned about mispronouncing people's names as they show up, but I'll do my best. So I can't speak for Weedsy, but my Discord server is for patrons. And there's nothing much else to it other than that. There's really nothing to do there. And I'm not hanging out there talking with people or anything like that. It's just something that is there. Like, if you have a Discord account, you get to have your own server. And they'll keep all the chats and things forever. I'm given to understand that the terms of use are not as wonderful as they might be, but they're not as bad as some. Or presumably they're not as bad as some. In any case, lots of people use these things. And the thing about Discord is I could fire up Discord now and patch the audio through into this stream. And then you'd be hearing what people were saying, discussing about that stuff. So the thing about the Minecraft idea is that it is a game that me and Weedsy could play on stream, and just, I don't know, on a weekly basis or whatever, because it's kind of like, there's no sense in doing something like that if you're like, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to abandon it immediately. But getting together in the same kind of regular basis and some appropriate time and going like, okay, we're going to derp around for 3 hours or so, however many. And the whole heart of doing something like that is opening it up to other people. So what you do is you'd show up at whatever time, you start doing the stream and go, okay, now let's go and we'll see what's going on. And then you show up in the server and it's like this giant smoking crater or something, or somebody has built an amazing thing, whatever. And then you go, oh, okay, and now what shall we do? Because your plans can change radically based on what was going on. Depending upon the kinds of players you get, and we both probably have somewhat older user bases than a lot of Minecraft people, you end up having sometimes people who are sort of very methodical and they just want to build huge, interesting things, and they make amazing stuff. And other kinds of servers, or servers that are like literally open to the public rather than just whitelisted, can wind up having people trolling them and visiting. They go, oh, this guy is making a YouTube, a Minecraft server and is on a stream. Let's go and literally destroy everything. And so they do. And it's like, yeah, that's great. You know, that can be amusing, but it can also get kind of old. So there are many interesting questions, but it could be a lot of fun, and it could be, particularly with regards to if we use Snowball Madness, which I designed, that could be along the lines of, oh, hey, very nice. That could be along the lines of snake oily kind of explorations, because the thing about that is Snowball Madness contains a lot of really twisted, strange things and destructive things and stuff. So it's like, so here is the snake oil myth to be tested. If you use the multiplier snowballs combined with TNT, can you blow a hole straight down to bedrock with a single shot? And can you do that on a survival server without blowing yourself up? And, hilarity ensues. Because one of the things about Snowball Madness is that there is a destructiveness element and it's like using magic spells or something, where these mechanics added to the game by this mod are very powerful, but can also be very dangerous. So yeah, we shall see, I guess, how that goes. Now, it's like 10 minutes to the end of my stream. I was asked for one other thing, and it was basically something that I can give a fairly quick answer. A fellow wrote me, and he said, as the live stream is happening today, I was wondering, if time allows, if you could give your input on AD, DA, DAC converters in general, and how much those have an effect on the listening situation, the premise being a trained ear and a big enough room for the proper inspection of sound. I'm quite confused as to what might be an affordable solution. There's all this hype for MyTech and dangerous converters, though buying the converters individually is quite unaffordable for beginners. At the moment, I'm still working with my Focusrite Scarlett 2i2, which has served me well up to now, but with the tips from my lovely customers, I might be able to upgrade. So I guess this is some question, audio pun. Is it worth it to spend big bucks for converters, even if they're not necessarily used for other outboard stuff, and having to invest also in a separate interface? So that is an interesting question that I got asked. And my interaction with converters has been kind of like this. I've had Focusrite. I've used just the basic computers, converters and stuff. I've used Lavery. And I've used Motu, recent Motu. And what I found was, as far as sort of general quality level, raw computer inputs and outputs, even the Apple, which is relatively decent, are like, only so good. The Focusrites, which is the kind that this fellow already has, were kind of better, but there was a limitation to how much better they could get. But they would get up to the zone where, Whitesea might be able to say under some circumstances that going better would be snake oil. It would depend, because what you end up having to do is getting, better converters on playback to be able to hear what the converters on recording are doing, and so on and so forth. Better speakers, monitoring. The thing is that when you combine all of that together, it starts getting really good. And when you start getting stuff really good, A, it's inspiring, and B, it kind of projects itself, and you can kind of hear the difference. So my ranking there, also, yeah, I've had Apogee as well. I didn't have Apogee for playback, but I was able to capture with them. But it was older Apogee, I actually still have it, that only did 44.1 and 48K, and I prefer to be able to go to 96. Just for additional room. I don't feel the need to go to 192, but I do prefer to go to 96 just because it's convenient to do that. So, my ranking order for those would be, the plain computer, and then the Focusrite, which is pretty respectable. Not, I wouldn't say great, but respectable. After that, the Motu, and that's this pretty substantial jump. I'm using a Motu 16A. It doesn't have any microphone preamps, but for line level stuff, it's pretty darn respectable. And beyond the Motu 16A, my Lavry is a little better, and the Apogee is a little better than the Motu, but it would be hard pressed to tell the difference. And if I'm not mistaken, when people talk about Mytek and dangerous converters, and Burl is another one, that's going to be also beyond the Lavry and Apogees and things. But that's one of those things where it's starting to get away from the raw quality of what it is and into having a sound of its own. Like you could, if you were going to go with the Burls, for instance, you might do just as well to do like a API preamp into Lavries or something, or an API preamp into Motu 16A, and use that to amplify up to line level, and then go at line level into the 16A, and that would probably work. So basically, the way this works is, for a fairly reasonable amount of money, you can get up to acceptable performance, depending upon whether you're needing to focus on line level or whether you're actually trying to record mics, because you do need to have decent preamplifiers for mics to really get impressive quality out of them. Something like your APIs and Neves and things like that, there is no complaint as far as the sound of those things are concerned, and you can use them on everything. You don't have to have special preamps for different kinds of sounds. And part of that is simply because the background noise level is very low and the headroom is very high, and they just will handle things correctly. It's kind of the same for Lavry. I'm looking to get, at some point in the future, Lavry analog to digital converters to match the DA10 that I've got, because it's got the right controls and things for what I'd need to do. It has a switch for switching it to mono. It has a switch for polarity switching and stuff like that. And 3 different kinds of clock synchronization. And I can use that and have it just do its job. And I could use I think it's a DA11 or something. The same kind, basically, for capturing into a recording thing. Like I'm capturing into my streaming just in stereo. I don't need to have massively multi-track for anything that I'm doing or plan to be doing on the primary computer that connects to the internet and streams and stuff, because I'm not actually mixing stuff in the box for all that I do, all this console and everything. Instead, I'm preferring to build my own analog mixing boards, which is actually something that Whitesy was doing for a while, and then we had an unfortunate video going like, I'm no longer going to be trying to build the mixing board. It's understandable. I'm not sure what mine is going to work out like, other than it's going to look really crazy and be really crude and not sophisticated. And I'll see what I'm going to be trying to do the analog version of what the console algorithm does. And then the 16A will move over to another computer, and it will be a dedicated tape machine. And I'll be recording into that and playing DAWs out as, 16 tracks that'll go into analog mixing, because that will continue to be the way that I like to do it. But it will have the capacity for running things like console. I'll probably run things like console if I needed to do submixes and have 16 tracks as stems. Could very well work out. Jolie. One of the things about being on the internet is you got to be able to roll with some of the funky internet denizens that you might have. And White Z is quite correct that you need to be able to scale the thing to whatever level you need. Like if 16 channels are not enough, you're going to need to run 2 interfaces, and they're going to need to be able to work with each other. So yeah, we're getting about down to the end of the stream. I will go off, and I don't know whether I'm going to... see you later, Tuoth. Here's Woth. But it's been an interesting stream. And Wadia. I've heard of Wadia before. Wadia is known in high-end circles. Wadia were some of the first DACs that internally upsampled to a high sample rate in order to produce their output. And that's exactly what they're for. That's exactly what the Wadias were for. Is they've always been used for things like playing CDs back and upsampling the CDs in sophisticated ways so that you get a more high quality output from them. One of the things I'm looking forward to when I get the other Lavry, because in getting the other Lavry, I'm going to have to get a Weiss interface that actually is FireWire, and I have a FireWire to Thunderbolt, and you can use the FireWire to Thunderbolt thing to run a modern Mac or whatever on FireWire converters, and the Weiss is a FireWire converter, and it can talk to the Lavrys using AES CBU or whatever it is, digital. And that'll open up the DAC to have a RCA and an optical output, so I could get a outboard CD player transport if I wanted to, and have that kicking around just in case I feel like throwing on like high quality audio just on a whim. Just throw that in there, and then rather than having to play it off of the computer, I'd be playing it off an additional transport and running it directly into the Lavry and doing it there. And it'll be an interesting question as to will that have an effect? Because one of the neat things about the Lavry is this. It has 3 different PLLs. PLL means phase-locked loop. Phase-locked loop means this is how it follows the data coming from the computer. You get like 1 bit at a time, or 1 audio word at a time, and it reconstructs the audio based on what it's being given. But if the computer is giving the information irregularly, that's called jitter. And it's essentially the same thing as aliasing in some ways, in that it can produce aliasing all by itself. But jitter is vibrations in the frequencies of the sample rate. And you don't assume that the sample rate has any vibrations in its frequencies, because the concept of it is like it's 44.1K and that's just what it is. But if you're giving that stream of audio from one thing to another thing, it's possible for the feeding of this data to be irregular, and then if it's not feeding data fast enough, the playback device has to wait to catch up. So it'll have a little phase-locked loop that is chasing that information. And if it's needing to catch up, or if the information is coming too fast, the phase-locked loop has to speed up or slow down in order to catch up with the data coming in. And that's jitter. That's frequency modulation of the music, the waveform that you're producing. It doesn't actually change the data that you've got on the computer, but it'll make it sound differently, and it can make it sound just as bad as aliasing or quantization does. And the Lavry has 3 different ways of dealing with it, because it has a wide phase-locked loop, which can chase variations very quickly, and it has a narrow, and then it has crystal. And crystal is an extremely narrow phase-locked loop. It's extremely regular. There's no jitter whatsoever, but it runs a lot of latency because it needs to keep this large buffer just to be able to slowly manipulate the frequencies, the information coming in. And anything that's conveying digital information from one thing to another, most certainly including converters, is going to run into that kind of stuff. Like, one of the reasons using the WISE to feed these converters is probably a good idea is that the WISE it's also a very expensive convertery kind of thing. It's like $2,000 worth of just sending out digital information, but it will be sending out digital information in this very steady, even way that's not going to stress the converters too hard. And then when you're using something like the Lavry for monitoring, your challenge there becomes you can put it on the wide phase lock loop for very low latency, or you can put it on Crystal, have it sound amazing, but then you've got slightly more latency and your computer already had latency, and the next thing you know, the stuff that you're doing is half a second, it's so much later that performing live along to anything would become a problem, and it's more geared towards, say, mastering or tuning mixes rather than performing along to whatever it is that you've got. So yeah, it's all very complicated, and it's all very interesting. But we will have ample time to talk about that, I think, in future, because this is my Monday stream, and I'll be back next Monday doing the same thing. This coming Tuesday at the same time in the same place, I'm going to be doing more music. I'm not sure what kind yet. I'll figure something out. And, Whitesy says he's going to email me a little bit later, which is fine. So if we do end up doing something on stream, it'll either be on this channel or I'm not sure what pulse code density is, Project, so I can't answer that. It's not necessarily a stupid question, but I've never heard of that concept. So don't worry about that. Guys, one thing I'm going to have to tell you, all of you, is you need to be more willing to ask stupid questions. Those are the ones you learn on, and those are where the really cool ideas are hiding. The coolest ideas are almost hiding in stuff which is like, well, this would be stupid. What would happen here? That's where the best stuff is. Because when you know what you're doing and you're like, this is not a stupid question because I understand the context of it, you're limiting yourself. You're sticking within something where, you know what happens, you know that you're not being stupid, you understand the context, and no new information can come in because you're just stuck with whatever it is. So the stupid questions are the ones you got to embrace that kind of stuff. The stupid questions are the ones that have the highest chance of producing a really cool idea or being a really good insight. It's like when a scientist goes, that's weird. Those are always the best moments because those that's weird. I wasn't expecting that. I am stupid enough that I did not understand what was happening. Those are always the ones that you want. Let's get stupid. And so on that stupid notion, let us stop streaming. And I'll catch up with you in the same stupid time, in the same stupid channel. And we'll see what stupid but secretly brilliant ideas we can come up with next. So for now, I will log off and I will talk to you later. Bye-bye.